All right. Hello and welcome everybody to the North Dakota Department of Mineral Resources Director's Cut. Today we have Mr. Lynn Helms, the Director of DMR, and Justin Kringstead, North Dakota Pipeline Authority Director. Please let us know in the chat if you're unable to hear us, and make sure that you type some questions and we can try to answer all of those. Okay. You actually have quite a few people on, so are you ready, Lynn?
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you for everyone that tuned in, and a special thank you to the one who actually showed up in person. If you've been dreaming of a white Christmas, you've come to the right place. We had record snowfall in November and record snowfall again in December. We seem to top the old record with each new record, so we'll get to that impact in just a minute. Looking at October production numbers, oil production was just as flat can be. About 0.02% change in production from September to October. So really no change, no measurable change whatsoever. We do want to note that New Mexico went up about 4%, and they just continue to experience those back-to-back production increases like we used to have 3 or 4 years ago. Eventually, the New Mexico play is going to mature like the Bakken, and we'll see that flatten out. Don't know where that's going to happen. When we look at natural gas production, it was actually down 1%, and I think that's interesting. I ought to speak to that just a little bit. I did a little bit of checking, and just about half of our drilling and completion activity is now taking place in Tier 2. So a large part of the activity has shifted out of the core area, which continues to experience growing gas oil ratio, into the much less drilled Tier 2 area. If you recall, excuse me, Tier 1 is 80 to 85% drilled out. Tier 2 is only about 50% drilled out. So we're seeing a lot more untapped reservoir with no depletion. And so we're seeing a lot lower gas oil ratios out in Tier 2. And so we may be seeing the beginning of a trend, which we've talked about, which was that we expected with the advent of 3-mile laterals, a lot more economic activity in Tier 2 and Tier 3 areas. And so, a couple interesting surprises. 2 of our counties with significant production increases were Divide and Burke. And we haven't talked about Divide County and Burke County for quite some time. So there's several indicators pointing to increased industry activity out in that Tier 2 and Tier 3 area. And that's all being brought about by the technology innovations that have allowed us to get to 3-mile laterals with virtually the same amount of time and expense as 2-mile laterals took in just a couple of years ago. Crude oil prices are down significantly, but they're still almost 50% above revenue forecast. So today we're estimating North Dakota crude is fetching about $73 a barrel. In October, it was around $84 a barrel. So there's a great deal of uncertainty in the crude oil markets, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But an interesting thing with the gas oil ratios, the rest of the numbers pretty stable. Saw a little bit of an uptick in active wells. That is not unusual as we go into fall and as we start to see people struggle to get workover rigs in to keep some of the lower producing wells on production. We hit an all-time high in terms of the number of wells actually producing, capable of production and actually producing. And just touching on the fact that frac crews, we had actually gotten to 20 frac crews in the state before the blizzard. But as of last week and certainly going into this week, there's virtually nobody completing wells. And so we're going to see an impact from that in production. And so we had seen a pretty significant uptick in the number of frac crews and a lot of duck wells being fracked, but that's changed now as we get into the really hard part of winter. And so that December, January, February typically are pretty low in terms of completion numbers. OPEC seems to be just managing world crude supplies on a month-to-month basis, kind of trying to gauge where the world economy is going and adjust appropriately. So you've got Russia sanctions, Russia price caps, China COVID lockdowns, and recessions or looming recessions in many of the OECD countries. And so OPEC is trying to balance all of that, and it's creating a significant amount of volatility in the oil markets as news comes out one way or the other. Natural gas storage is just about we're at the 5-year average, but with the much colder weather setting in and with LNG exports rising rapidly to Europe, we're seeing very strong natural gas prices, $6.76 an MCF. And so those are really good natural gas prices, unlike the days when we saw 20 to 25 to 1 crude oil to natural gas prices. We're about 11 to 1 right now. So significant incentives for natural gas capture. And it's great to see that every single category from statewide to fee Fort Berthold Reservation is well above the 91% capture number that the Industrial Commission requires. Still monitoring 4 areas that are lagging. Big Bend, Deepwater Creek Bay, Twin Buttes, and Charleston, but those all saw an increase. And so everything in terms of gas capture moving in the right direction in terms of flaring reduction. And the only thing I want to comment on is that Industrial Commission tomorrow will be looking at comments that I have written on the BLM EA, which is looking at leases from 2015 to 2020 and the social cost of greenhouse gases and how that perhaps should impact permitting and whether those leases should be canceled or what should go on there. So we'll be looking at comments tomorrow. I've submitted those to the commission members and they're reviewing those. We are contemplating litigation in that area, particularly surrounding the failure to hold first quarter, third quarter, and fourth quarter lease sales for North Dakota tracts. There are hundreds of tracts that are available for leasing, but the leasing is just not happening. That is all of my direct comments. I guess I should make one comment about the blizzard. Justin has done some analysis and I'll talk about it a little bit. Our current estimate is somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 barrels a day shut in as a result of the blizzard. Day 1, 2, 3, they held in there pretty good, but as you saw, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, there was no travel advised anywhere in the state of North Dakota. So crude oil trucks were not moving, pumpers weren't on the road, tanks filled up and wells were shut down. And so we're estimating that as of today, probably as of yesterday, we're below 1 million barrels a day, probably well below 1 million barrels a day. So industry is going to attempt to get back to work this week, but it's almost Christmas. So it's a holiday week, and we are anticipating following last week's snow, we're now going to go into a period where the daytime highs are going to be below 0. So it will be very difficult to get the roads open and get the wells back on. Once a well goes down in this kind of weather, it can be extremely challenging to get that pumping unit up and running again and get all the pumps and the equipment warm again so that you can maintain production. So probably a significant amount of that production will stay offline until after New Year's. I would expect it's going to take a few weeks to recover from all the shut-in wells. So as of right now, we're estimating at least 300,000 barrels a day that's shut in, which puts us down in that 800,000, 900,000 per day number, significantly below 1 million barrels a day. I think, it's a short part of December, so we should average over 1 million barrels a day, and hopefully the recovery will go pretty quickly after the first of the year. We'll see what January brings. This is the most significant difference between North Dakota and New Mexico, they're both shale plays, they're both oil plays, but we have winter, and they kind of do. So with that, we'll take questions.
I have one question. How would you sum up the state of oil production of 2022, and what is your expectation going forward?
Yeah, great question. So summing up 2022 was very slow recovery from the pandemic. A little bit of recovery, but really flat production. And we had hoped, projected, expected after meeting with oil and gas companies in the February-March timeframe in Houston that we might reach that 1.2 million barrels a day by the end of the year. We didn't get there. We got to 1.1 million barrels a day. Going forward, they're talking the same story. There are so many headwinds. As you can see, the price volatility is built into the equation, as well as the resistance from the federal administration to growing production and issuing federal leases. New rules coming into play about venting and flaring and emissions and methane and greenhouse gases. And so the significant players in North Dakota's production are talking 1 or 2% growth next year. So pretty flat. Well, thanks everyone. Go ahead.
So if you could wave your magic wand, what would it take to ramp up production?
Great. So the question from the room was, if you could wave your magic wand, what would it take to increase production? Based on conversations with the oil and gas companies and the service companies, $98 oil and workforce. So we still have got thousands of jobs open in the state, hundreds, if not thousands of jobs open in the industry. So you've got a combination of two factors there. One is the uncertainty in the oil prices and that continued volatility, but just as heavy a weight on the industry is the inability to attract workforce. So if I had a magic wand, I would wave it and there would be a large herd of oil and gas workers appear, and the oil price, the NYMEX price would go to $98. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. What are we doing first?
Just the slide deck. Yep. You're ready?
Yeah, ready.
Perfect. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Justin Krinkstead, Director of the North Dakota Pipeline Authority. We'll get right into our neighboring states. We have seen another uptick from last month on the drilling in eastern Montana. So they're now up to 4 active drilling rigs in eastern Montana. South Dakota still at 0. So all in within the basin, somewhere in that mid to upper 40s. So when we're looking at transportation dynamics, continued growth within the region, I'm expecting Montana to hold at least steady. We'll see. Winter's going to be rough for both states, so I'm not anticipating any major growth. But if they're able to clip along, they don't have a whole lot of production currently, so growing might not be overly difficult for them. But we'll keep a close eye on that, and again, how the two states interact with our midstream sectors. And as Lynn alluded to, again, the production changes, oil and gas. We did see another back-to-back month of lower GORs again that is not overly concerning. If you look back historically, there are trends where you see, because of, again, where that drilling is located, where those completions are taking place, the overall trend remains consistent, and we're still going to continue to plan for that increase in gas oil ratio. I don't think that this one, again, a month of going down indicates any type of concern that we're not going to continue to see that long-term trend. We cited some shifts on the way that crude oil is leaving the region. We saw some pullback again on the utilization of crude by rail and some growth in the crude export by pipeline systems. We look at it on a percentage basis, you can see in the blue portion that is the pipeline industry's market share of transportation out of the region. So that is continuing to march forward, continuing to see less and less reliance on that crude by rail, continuing to see incredibly strong economics for the Bakken production within the state and the economics, and I'll dig into it here in a moment, but really favoring those movements out of the region on a pipeline system. So just taking a look at, this is September, it's delayed a month from what our production is, but what the oil refiners were paying around the US, PAD 1, PAD 5 being the highest priced markets, and we've now seen that spread widened out. If you remember several months ago, PAD 2, the Midwest, was on par with some of those coastal markets. That has widened again, but with the adequate transport options on pipe, the strong Clearbrook pricing that we're continuing to see for that Bakken barrel in the region, I suspect we're going to continue to see that dominant mode be on the pipeline systems unless we really start to see things in the marketplace get out of whack. And here on slide 7 is my estimate. So somewhere around that 60 to 70,000 barrels of crude oil per day leaving the region by rail car. So that's now slightly less than one train per day on average, compared to, again, 10 years or so ago when we were looking at 10 plus trains per day leaving the region. So down substantially. Destinations continue to dominate over on the PAD 5 West Coast area, including not only Washington State, but we have seen periodically some deliveries going to those California markets as well, where they'll look at blending that Bakken barrel in for various refining run reasons. What prices are doing, we're still seeing a premium at that Clearbrook, Minnesota hub for that Bakken barrel. Continuing to see sub $5 spreads between Cushing and those Brent markets, which again, it's difficult to incentivize incremental crude by rail out of the region at that market point, and especially when that Midwest is so strong. And again, I believe that a lot of that's tied to what was taking place in 2022 related to synthetic crude oil out of Canada that comes down through Clearbrook. The Bakken barrel competes with it at Clearbrook, and we had some maintenance things we were seeing up at Canada that lifted all boats heading into that PAD 2 marketplace. Imports, exports across the border, really no changes to speak of there. And then again, month to month, consistent 5% flaring, looking at it statewide, no shift at all in why those flares were occurring. The dominant cause continues to be well systems. There are well sites that are connected to gathering systems, but they do not have adequate capacity. Again, I'll reiterate, this becomes even more challenging within the winter time as the ground temperatures continue to drop. We're going to see that accelerate this week with the extreme colds that the region is going to experience. As those ground temperatures drop, that cools the pipe, cools the flow through those systems, and all those natural gas liquids, your propanes, butanes, condensates, they'll start to settle out and really becomes challenging for those midstream operators to keep gas flowing. And when we have the prioritization that we've seen of keeping flaring to a minimum at the well site, operators will react accordingly to make sure that they are not exceeding their own internal targets. So slide 12, that's just historic data. I won't dig into that too far. We did see another blip up for wells producing gas over wells selling gas. Again, wintertime, as we're getting into this time period, this gets a little bit more tricky to watch because, again, building pipe, getting connections, all the things that have to get done out in the field become more and more challenging in the wintertime. So we'll keep a close eye on this. I'm hopeful that folks are going to be well coordinated, that we don't see any significant changes to statewide flaring as a result. The December update for crude oil price outlook. Again, they are expecting some weakness through the end of 2022, and I think we're currently experiencing that. Their viewpoint for 23 is a little bit of a tightening scenario, with prices recovering back into those mid to upper $80 range. So again, with what they see happening with supply and demand, we'll see how that pans out. But again, they are anticipating some strengthening as we head into the new year. Gas processing continues to be adequate for the region. We're still looking out at the 2023, 2024, 25 timeframe for the need for more processing capacity. So stay tuned on that front. And then just a couple of other updates as it relates to natural gas transmission out of the region. Continuing to see the lion's share of Northern Border be those Bakken molecules. We did see, again, a couple more days where we were seeing that BTU number jumping above 1,100. Again, with everything that's in place today, that doesn't mean anything. However, it's an indicator because we have seen attempts in the past where maybe there would be some type of limits put on the Bakken gas as it leaves North Dakota related to its BTU, its energy content leaving the state. So if that continues to trend upwards, we'll keep a close eye on that and what implications it may have within the region. And then just a couple of reminders. These are just some slides from last month that we'll be back here in a month. But when we look at the November timeframe, a few different things occurring. Outage at the St. Anthony compressor station on Northern Border, Glenolin work, winter storms that came early to the region. So November is going to be another tough month, both from an operations in the field and the midstream component of it. So winter certainly came early for North Dakota. I think meteorology, the official first day of winter is not till Wednesday of this week. So this was a rough fall, we'll call it. Record snowfall, extreme colds, and a lot of time left here for this winter to play out. So with that, I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Got a few, just curiosity, because of all the talk of the rail strike, could that have hampered moving of crude oil or that by rail?
Well, okay, good question. So for those online that may not have heard that, it was related to the potential rail strikes and what that would do as it relates to production movement out of the region. So when we look at overall pipeline capacity relative to production, we do have adequate pipeline capacity to move 100% of North Dakota's oil production. The rail volumes out of the region are what I would consider elective at this time as it relates to what market prices are doing. So I don't think we would see a major impact to North Dakota's production. I think we've got the flexibility to move barrels around if necessary. Who it would impact, obviously, is the folks that rely on those Bakken barrels coming to them that do not have a pipeline connection. So those refineries in Washington State or other refineries on the East Coast that rely on those Bakken barrels, they would be negatively impacted, most certainly.
Do you want to come sit by him? I have questions for both of you. Join.
We're staying in the spotlight.
Yeah. Slowly
I
slide
couldn't get
over.
the snow off, but it fits pretty well right now, so.
right. Yeah.
Do you have an estimate of how much associated gas production has been shut in during the current weather? And I know you said that already, but we state that again.
I think I talked about crude oil.
Yeah.
Justin, do you have an estimate of what that translates to in terms of gas volume?
Assuming if you just take that 300 to 400,000 and then multiply it by that gas oil ratio, I think that would give you a good sense of where it's falling. So take 300 to 400,000 barrels per day times 2.81, and that will give you an MCF of gas. I won't try to do that off the top of my head.
So we're probably looking at somewhere around 700,000 a day.
Yeah, ballpark.
In that neighborhood. Yeah. So
You mentioned the federal rules on venting and flaring.
MCF.
yeah, 0.7 BCF a day.
Oh, very good.
Yeah.
You mentioned the federal rules on venting and flaring. What impact will they have in North Dakota? And what does DMR do in response?
Yeah, so with regards to the new rules on venting and flaring, they likely are going to impact some of the lower rate say generation 1, 2, 3 Bakken wells, where it's possible that a lot of additional capital would be required to update facilities. And the economics are not going to be great for that. So it's going to be difficult. We'll see what the rules say. First of all, I think our comments are going to push for some type of a lower limit, something like the stripper well exemptions that occur for lower producing wells. I think the other states will join us in that the earlier wells that are producing at lower rates get an exemption from some of the rule requirements. We're certainly going to comment on the fact that this really ought to be EPA's realm, and they're proposing rules as well. So the idea that Department of Interior and EPA are double dipping on this, again, takes us back to the litigation world. And I think that North Dakota is very seriously anticipating litigating this, just like we did the 2016 BLM venting and flaring rule, to make sure that the administration understands that emissions and that sort of thing belong with the EPA. And those are Quad O things. Those are Department of Environmental Quality permitting issues. They don't belong with the Department of Interior. The other problem with the Department of Interior getting involved in that is something called communitization agreements, which really puts them in control of spacing units that might be 95% private and state, but because of a very small federal interest inside the spacing unit, they would take over control and dominate and perhaps require things that would be damaging to the correlative rights of the private and state minerals. So there's going to be extensive commenting on the rule. There is likely going to be litigation if they push forward with it.
Thank you. We have one more. What is the status, if any, of the Belfield refinery?
You know anything about it, Justin?
No update.
So I don't have an update either. It's interesting. I had a conversation with Department of Environmental Quality late last week when we were all working from home, and I failed to ask that question. I do believe that their permit extension expired, but I don't know if they have applied for another extension or if that has been granted. So please contact DEQ. That's where the water and air permits for that refinery lie. And they were relying on an extension that I think took them through the month of September. So they may have applied for an additional extension. I just don't know the answer to that. And I failed to ask that question. We talked about a lot of other things.
Any more?
Yeah, I was wondering what effect, if any, did the Keystone being shut down have on North Dakota?
Yep. So for those online, the question was about the Keystone pipeline and any impacts in North Dakota. So the Keystone pipeline does originate in Canada. It does transport crude oil through North Dakota. However, it does not have any interaction with North Dakota's oil and gas markets. It does not transport or interconnect with any of our existing pipeline systems. So no impact to the state of North Dakota.
Not any demand uptick because of it?
I have not seen anything directly as it related to that. There's concerns that depending upon the duration of that outage, the volumes at Cushing, it's typically a different crude barrel quality than a Bakken barrel, so not a real direct connection. But if it had any type of extended outage, which it's not looking like that's going to be the case, then we would have been more concerned about just overall U.S. inventory levels. But directly to North Dakota, really no major impact.
Yeah, we haven't seen anything direct from the Keystone shutdown. I think, Justin, you talked a little bit about crude oil prices at Clearbrook, and it's interesting, the last 2 months have been the lowest price discount for North Dakota crude that we've ever seen in our careers. And that's a result of lower Canadian volumes flowing through the Enbridge system, which has really ramped up the demand for North Dakota crude oil at the Clearbrook hub. And so those prices are super strong. Justin showed that on his map. And the result has been some shift, as much as people could possibly do, shifting crude oil to that system to get it to Clearbrook. So we've seen extremely low price differentials. You can remember the days when we complained about $20 price differentials between WTI and North Dakota. It's running around 50 cents now. So if that gives you any indication, never seen price differentials that low or a price basis that's strong for North Dakota crude. And that's directly related to lower Canadian volumes coming into that hub and the demand for North Dakota crude there.
Okay, Justin. End of the month. Deadline, correct?
Correct. Yep.
Any action on the pipeline from the Bakken, the natural gas?
Yep. So the question was related to the natural gas grant program for natural gas pipeline development in the state. And we had a December 15th deadline for grant applications for a system to move from Western North Dakota to Eastern North Dakota. We did not receive any applications for that deadline. So I'm meeting with the commission tomorrow. We'll likely talk about if there are going to be any next steps, especially as we head into the legislative session and what that's going to look like. But no applications came in. I wouldn't say I was overly surprised. Obviously, I work quite closely with them. The biggest challenge remains lining up those end users, and those end users being willing and able to commit to using the system and the volume sufficient to make a project of that size work. That's been incredibly challenging, and it's going to continue to remain challenging until we can get some more projects in the hopper and moving forward.
I think you could anticipate some legislation to change the way those ARPA dollars might be applied to the Pipeline Authority. I know Justin has talked about an amendment, and there may be some from legislators themselves, but they want to try to find a way to make it more attractive for that $150 million in ARPA funds to get out there and incentivize industry to build that pipeline. So I think you can expect likely some changes to how the Pipeline Authority is addressed and how they can apply funds in terms of incentivizing pipeline construction.
Yeah, this will not be the last you've heard of efforts. The efforts and the desire are still as strong as ever to get it done. It's just this current program and the timing wasn't in the cards for a December deadline.
And I think it's important to note that the ARPA funds don't have to be spent until December 31st of 24. So we have time to work on legislation and go through additional grant efforts and efforts to try to get that pipeline underway. So.
All right, that's great. That's all the questions we have. Thanks so much for joining us.
Justin disappeared there for a minute.
Oh,
okay, I can't pull that off. All right. He did a Harry Potter on us.
It's come and passed and nothing, so.
Nice.